Okay, welcome back, American history students. This is section 2 of chapter 11, talking about the Civil War here. This section focuses really on kind of like the politics of the war. You'll kind of see the Americans standing with Britain and some of the political actions that Lincoln and Jefferson Davis took. Okay, so you need to know that leading up to this, that there was a very close relationship between Britain and the South. All that cotton, the South, raw cotton, they would send it to Britain, where Britain would process it and make shirts and pants and stuff like that, and kind of sell it back to the United States and back to other places around the world. So a very important economical relationship there. Well, the South is hoping that they can get Britain to kind of be on their side because they need them. Unfortunately for them, Britain had abolished slavery in 1833. So for several decades now, they've been against slavery. And a lot of the people in Britain don't want to support the South. But the South is still going to try to court British support. One of the reasons that Britain doesn't need the South anymore is by this time they have colonized both Egypt and India. And those are two areas where a lot of cotton is produced. So they don't have to have that American cotton, not to the point where they would go to war for it. Okay. Now, the South, very important event that happens in this time period. The South sends two men to go to Britain to try to convince them to help the South out. But the two men are caught in the Union blockade surrounding the southern ports, and they're arrested. Well, they're arrested on a British ship called the Trent, and this angers the British, if you will, and they threaten war. And Lincoln doesn't want to he doesn't want to have two wars. He's got his hands full fighting the South. He certainly doesn't want to have to try to fight the British and the South at the same time. So Lincoln ends up freeing the two men and kind of keeps this from going any further than it was. But it was kind of a sticky situation there for just a little bit. Now, let's think about Lincoln and his politics towards slavery. Lincoln did not like slavery. He was an anti-slavery guy. But he was also a lawyer, and he didn't believe that the federal government actually had the power to abolish slavery where it already existed in America. Now, he was for keeping slavery out of all new territories acquired. So anything from the Mexican territories, he thought that should be anti-slavery. Any new territories gained by the United States, in his opinion, should be anti-slavery. But of course, politically speaking, that would upset the balance in the Senate. And Southerners viewed Lincoln as a guy who would end up killing slavery. Now, when the war began, it was a war over states' rights. Now, that state right that's being fought over, of course, is the right to own slaves. But 2 years into the war, in 1863, the whole scope of the war changes. Because on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issues something called the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, in the proclamation, he is going to free all slaves in existing rebelling states. Now, there were 4 border states, of course, that were southern states that had slavery. Because they had not seceded from the Union, so they could continue to have their slaves. Now, again, you got to remember that this is just a on paper kind of thing. It's symbolic, if you will. Until Union troops actually come and free the slaves, the emancipation really is just that. It's just a proclamation. It's just a saying, okay? But very important, very symbolic. It's going to give a lot of hope to the slaves there in the South. But it does change the purpose of the war. From that point on, no longer is the war being fought over a states' right or bringing the rebellious states back into the Union. It's being fought to get rid of this horrific institution of slavery. Now, the reactions to this were very different. Now, in the South, of course, they thought this was the worst thing ever, as you can imagine. But in the North, it was a little bit mixed. Many Northerners welcomed this, and they had these great get-togethers with freed blacks up north. And some other Northerners did not want to fight to free slaves. They didn't care anything about that. This was all about forcing Southerners to come back into the Union, that they were doing something that they couldn't do. So there were those who didn't really like the Emancipation Proclamation. So it was a little bit split there. You need to know that there are some groups in both areas, that neither one of these areas was completely unified. There were Southerners who wanted to remain in the Union, Northern sympathizers, as they were called. And in the North, there were Southern sympathizers who said, what right do we have to force them to remain in our country? What right do we have to take their property, in this instance, slaves? Now, in the North, these tended to be Democrats. Northern Democrats were known as Copperheads. Obviously, you can get the reference there. And in the South, sometimes you would have these people have their houses burnt if they supported the Union. All right. Switching gears just a little bit, because they're not, both sides doesn't have complete unification. Both Jefferson Davis, president of the South, and Abraham Lincoln, president of the Union, kind of had to resort to some measures that were going beyond probably their powers. All right, they suspended several civil liberties during the Civil War. Now Lincoln did it first. He suspended something known as habeas corpus, the writ of habeas corpus, and basically that is that you have a right to know why you're being jailed and that you can be appointed a trial in a fairly speedy manner. He's not. Any dissenters against the war, he's going to basically throw them in jail. Most of them get released within a couple of days, but he's basically sending a message that this war is too big for you to sow dissent at home. Jefferson Davis at first used this against Lincoln and tried to make Lincoln look like a power-hungry, demagogue, but shortly after he would have to do the same thing because there were a lot of riots and dissension in the South as well. Definitely with Lincoln, when you think about Lincoln, you need to think of a president that expanded the power of the presidency, the power of the federal government beyond anything that it had ever seen up to this point. No president wielded as much power. Even Andrew Jackson, Washington, any of those guys, none of them wielded as much power as Lincoln did, because none of them have been faced with with something on the level of what Lincoln was being faced with here in the Civil War. Now, in the beginning, there were plenty of volunteers because everyone thought it was going to be a short war and they were going to cover themselves with glory. As this thing drags on and the body bags start coming home, people are a little less willing to go fight. So both sides are going to resort to conscription, which is basically the draft. Now, in the South, in the beginning, anywhere from 18 to 35 years of age, you were eligible to be drafted. As the war went on and losses mounted, that number changed from 17 all the way up to 50 years old that you could actually be drafted. Now, there's an interesting thing. They passed a law that allows you to hire a substitute. So if you get drafted and you have money, you can pay some poor guy who needs the money really badly, who's willing to risk his life going to war, and they can take your place. Well, this makes people angry, as you can imagine, because now all of a sudden it seems like it's a poor man's fight, a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, because we're fighting really, in essence, over slaves. And poor people in the South didn't have slaves. Very few people in the South actually owned slaves. The rich owned slaves, and it's only the rich who can hire substitutes. Now, to be fair, the vast majority of Southerners who were eligible to fight did. 90% of all Southerners, including those rich people, because they had the most to lose, actually went off to war. So it's an incredible number. 9 out of 10 eligible men in the South go off to war. Now in the North, it's a little, the range isn't quite as much because they have a much larger population. So between 20 and 45 years of age, you were eligible to be drafted in the Union Army. Now, not very many people actually had to be drafted. 92% of all men, and there were about 2 million men who served in the Civil War from the North, about 92% of all of them were actually volunteers, including 180,000 free blacks who volunteered after the Emancipation Proclamation, which also gave them the right to actually join the Army, something that they've been trying to do since the beginning of the war. Okay, so they finally have their chance to fight to free their brothers and sisters in bondage down in the South. Now, last little part right here. There were some draft riots going on in the North. One of the most famous happened in New York City, and it was with the Irish, large Irish population there. And the Irish had kind of served this, they were almost slaves. They were the poorest of the poor. They had the jobs that no one else would do. And they were afraid that, they didn't want to go fight and possibly die to free slaves who were probably then going to come north and work for even cheaper than them and take their jobs from them. So they were very unhappy with this, and so there was a massive draft riot that actually resulted in about 100 people losing their lives. Okay, so in this section, you're seeing the political aspects of the Civil War, what the two sides, the two presidents had to go through to maintain order, and basically who was eligible for being conscripted and stuff like that. Okay, thank you, and I'll see you in section 3.